Hey everyone, and welcome back. We've got a really interesting set of sources about work culture in India. It seems like everyone has an opinion on this topic, from CEOs to employees, and, well, we're going to dive into all of it today.
Yeah, it's certainly a hot topic, and it's one that affects everyone.
The material you sent over focuses on this idea of work-life balance, or maybe the lack of it, in India. And it's been especially buzzy lately. I mean, I know India's economy is growing super fast, but some of these expectations around work hours seem pretty extreme, even for the most dedicated employees.
It really blew up recently after the chairman of Larsen and Toubro, this huge Indian company, kind of offhandedly mentioned that employees could potentially be working 90-hour weeks, like including Sundays.
Whoa, 90 hours. That's a lot. I could see why that sparked some controversy.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There was a massive backlash, and the company quickly tried to walk it back. They were saying that it wasn't like an official policy or anything, just, a casual comment.
But even so, I imagine that kind of statement really got people thinking, right? About the larger expectations around work in India.
For sure. It brought to light this underlying issue of India's, I guess you could call it obsession with like long working hours. It's not so much about productivity or output, but yeah, just like sheer time spent working.
So we've got this controversy with Larson and Toubro, which is kind of a jumping off point.
Yeah.
But looking at the sources you sent, it looks like there are actually quite a few business leaders in India who kind of agree with this idea of extended work hours. I mean, we've got guys like Narayana Murthy, the founder of Infosys.
Right. And Babish Agarwal from Ola, they're both kind of on the same page, arguing that these extended hours are like crucial if India wants to keep up in the global market. It's almost like they're framing it as this patriotic duty to work yourself to the bone. Like if you're not pushing yourself to the limit, you're somehow letting the country down.
It's a pretty powerful narrative.
Mm.
But I mean, where does that leave employee well-being? And, where do we draw the line between dedication and exploitation?
Mm. It's a valid question. You've got some sources from the other side of the debate too, right? People pushing back on this always on mentality.
Exactly. Business leaders like Anupam Mittal, he's the founder of Shadi.com, and Adar Poonawalla, who runs the Serum Institute.
Yeah.
They're kind of the counter argument, saying that we need to prioritize well-being, encourage people to focus on deep work, set boundaries, and, actually end up getting better results that way.
Hmm. Better results. So it's not just about working harder, but working smarter, right?
Exactly. But, it's easy to say that when you're already at the top. How do these CEOs, who are all for shorter work weeks, how do they really know what everyday employees are going through?
That's true. I mean, are they just out of touch? Or do they genuinely believe that this different approach to work can be good for both, for individuals and for the company?
It's a tricky situation. It's not just a debate about, like, work-life balance. It's about what success really means, especially in a country like India that's growing so quickly.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating. We talk about economic progress and growth, but what's the human cost of all this? We're talking about real people, not just numbers on a spreadsheet.
And speaking of real people, you included some pretty sobering statistics in the research you sent over. The International Labor Organization, the ILO, found that over half of Indian employees are working more than 49 hours a week.
Yeah, that's one of the highest rates globally.
It is. And to add to that, despite all those long hours, India's per capita income is still pretty low.
So people are working incredibly hard, but not necessarily seeing the financial rewards.
It's almost like a sign of exploitation, wouldn't you say?
It does raise some concerns, definitely. And when you start looking at legal protections for workers in India, it gets, well, even more concerning.
Yeah, we were talking about Australia's right to disconnect law earlier, which is pretty amazing. In India, you technically get overtime pay after 48 hours.
But the enforcement isn't always there, especially with smaller companies or in the informal sector.
So workers are feeling pressured to put in these insane hours, and they're not even always getting paid for it.
Right. And then it becomes a question of what does that kind of schedule do to your health, your relationships, your overall well-being?
And we have some pretty startling numbers about that, too. A study by MediBuddy and the Confederation of Indian Industry found that 62% of Indian employees are experiencing burnout.
That's crazy, right? Like 3 times the global average.
It's definitely a cause for concern. And then you've got the World Health Organization linking these extended work hours to some serious health risks, like heart attacks and heart disease.
Okay, now I'm starting to get flashbacks to our last deep dive when we talked about, well, I won't go there. But before I totally freak out, let's try to shift gears a little. It can't all be doom and gloom, can it? There have to be some solutions, right? Some ways to create a healthier work culture in India. Where do we even begin to untangle this? I think the good news is that there's growing awareness of the problem. And that's always the first step. People are talking about it, both in India and internationally. And it's not just employees, it's business leaders, it's policymakers, even global organizations. There seems to be this realization that something needs to change.
So what kinds of changes are people talking about? I mean, we touched on the right to disconnect law. And of course, enforcing existing labor laws is a big one. But what else is out there? Our listeners probably on the edge of their seat waiting for some real, tangible solutions.
Well, there are a lot of interesting ideas floating around, and some of them might just surprise you. Why don't we dig into those in the next part of our deep dive?
Okay, so we've talked about the problems, the challenges that workers in India are facing, this whole work-life balance thing.
Yeah.
But it sounds like people are starting to look for solutions, which is definitely a good sign. So where do we go from here? What can people actually do to make things better?
Well, you mentioned the government earlier, and one of the articles you sent, it talks about this right to disconnect law that they have in Australia.
Yeah, it basically gives workers the legal right to like not answer work emails or calls outside of work hours, which is, pretty radical. But could something like that actually work in India? Like, wouldn't it be super hard to enforce?
Yeah, it definitely wouldn't be easy. I mean, work culture in India is pretty ingrained, right? It's not going to change overnight. But the thing is, it's not like the concept's totally unheard of. We were talking about the Indian Factories Act, right? It already requires overtime pay after 48 hours a week. The problem is it's not always enforced, like we were saying.
So maybe a starting point would be to strengthen those existing laws, make sure they're actually being followed, especially in those industries where workers are, being exploited.
Absolutely, yeah. But even beyond the government, like companies themselves can do a lot to make the work environment healthier. We were talking about deep work earlier, right? This idea of focusing on like really important tasks without getting interrupted. What if what if instead of praising employees for like pulling all-nighters, managers encourage them to actually disconnect, like
Yeah.
take breaks, recharge, come back refreshed.
That reminds me of one of the articles that talked about how companies like Shadi.com, that big matrimonial site, they're already experimenting with stuff like that.
Mm.
They've put policies in place to like minimize communication after hours, encourage employees to take breaks. And guess what? Their productivity hasn't gone down. Some people even say it's gone up.
It's a great example of how prioritizing well-being, it doesn't have to mean sacrificing results. It can actually improve things. When employees feel valued, respected, not burnt out all the time, they're going to be more engaged, more motivated, and more productive.
Okay, so that's companies, but what about individuals? What can regular workers do to like deal with this demanding work culture and protect themselves, especially if their company isn't exactly on board with these, more progressive ideas?
Yeah, I mean, that's where it can get a little tricky, but it's not hopeless. One of the most powerful things you can do is learn to set boundaries, learn to say no, to delegate tasks if you can, to communicate your availability clearly. It might feel kind of awkward at first, especially in a culture where being busy is seen as like a status symbol.
Yeah, but it's important, right, to recognize that you have a right to a life outside of work, that prioritizing your well-being isn't like selfish, that it actually helps you be your best self, both, at work and in your personal life.
Absolutely. And there are also like practical things you can do, like
Mm.
techniques for managing your workload and your stress. You've probably heard of the Pomodoro technique, right? You work in like focused bursts with breaks in between, or time blocking, scheduling specific times for different tasks.
Yeah, these sound pretty straightforward, but
Yeah,
I guess they can really help you, like stay focused, avoid feeling overwhelmed.
exactly. But let's be real, it's one thing to know about these techniques. It's another thing to actually put them into practice, especially when you're feeling all this pressure to like constantly perform.
Yeah, that's true. So what do we do about that underlying anxiety?
Well, one of the articles you sent, it mentioned the rising cost of living in India and how savings are actually going down for a lot of urban workers.
So there's this economic insecurity that's driving people to work these long hours just to, make ends meet,
Yeah.
even if it's hurting their health.
Exactly. It's kind of a vicious cycle. The economic pressure leads to overwork, which leads to burnout, health problems, which makes it even harder to, earn a living. It's like they're stuck.
So we need to think beyond just individual solutions then.
Absolutely. We need to talk about fair wages, affordable health care, those kinds of social safety nets that can help people who are struggling.
So that people don't have to choose between, their health and their livelihood. They feel secure enough to, take care of themselves without worrying about going broke.
Exactly. It's a shift in mindset, not just for individuals, but for companies and the government, too.
It's about recognizing that a healthy workforce is, well, it's the right thing to do, but it's also good for the economy.
For sure. When people are rested, when they feel valued, supported, they're more likely to be creative, productive. They're going to contribute more in the long run.
So we've talked about individual strategies, systemic changes, all this stuff. But one of the articles you sent mentioned this idea of shorter work weeks, like 4 days instead of 5. Now that sounds pretty radical. Could that actually work?
It might sound crazy, but it's gaining some traction. I mean, some companies are starting to experiment with it, even in India. The thinking is that, by making the work week shorter, you actually encourage people to be more focused and efficient during those working hours.
Okay, 4-day work weeks? I gotta admit, I'm intrigued. Like, less work, more free time, sign me up. Right. But I'm sure it's not quite that simple.
You're right. It's not a magic bullet that's going to work for everyone. But it's interesting, some companies, even in India, they're actually starting to try it out. So the idea is if you condense the work week, people are going to be more focused, more efficient during the time they are working.
So it's like instead of stretching things out over 5 days, you're buckling down and getting stuff done in 4.
Exactly. You cut out all those unnecessary meetings, prioritize the important tasks, and you might even end up getting the same amount of work done, maybe even more in less time. And think about that extra day off. People can recharge, spend time with family, pursue their hobbies, all the things that make for a happier, healthier life.
It makes sense. I mean, happy employees are usually more productive, right? But wouldn't this be a nightmare for some industries? Like think about hospitals or, factories that are running 24/7. How could they possibly make that work?
Yeah, some sectors would definitely face some unique challenges. But even in those cases, you could probably come up with some creative solutions, maybe a rotating schedule so different teams have different days off and you've always got coverage. Or maybe like a hybrid model where some employees have a 4-day week, others stick with the traditional 5 days depending on what their job is.
It sounds like it would take a lot of, planning and coordination.
Yeah.
But the potential benefits for people and for society as a whole, they're pretty impressive.
For sure. Studies have shown that shorter work weeks can actually lead to higher productivity, people are less stressed, morale is better, and even carbon emissions go down. It's like everybody wins.
Okay, I'm pretty much convinced.
Yeah.
But I imagine trying to get companies to make such a big change, it wouldn't be easy, right? There's this idea that longer hours automatically mean more output. It's so ingrained.
That's where we need to, challenge those old ways of thinking about productivity. It's not about how many hours you spend at your desk. It's about, what you actually accomplish. Are people coming up with creative solutions? Are they working together effectively? Are they contributing to the success of the team, the organization? That's what really matters.
So it's not about tracking how long someone's sitting at their desk. It's about the quality of their work, the impact they're having.
Exactly. And that means we need a different approach to, evaluating performance, one that focuses on outcomes, not just output.
This is bigger than just a 4-day work week, isn't it? It's it's a whole different way of thinking about work, about its role in our lives.
You got it. It's about recognizing that people are more than just workers. They have families, they have passions, they have things going on outside of their jobs. And when companies support that, when they help their employees live full, balanced lives, everybody benefits.
It's encouraging to see that this conversation's happening, that people are, questioning the way things have always been done and looking for alternatives.
And it's not just in India, it's a global movement. You've got countries like Iceland, Japan, New Zealand. They're all experimenting with shorter work weeks and seeing some really positive results.
It makes you wonder, what if India embraced this too? Could it become like a global leader in promoting a healthier, more sustainable way of working?
That's a great question. And ultimately, the answer is not just up to the government or business leaders. It's up to each and every one of us.
So, to our listener, we want to leave you with this. What kind of work environment do you want to be a part of? What does work-life balance look like to you? And what can you do, even if it's a small thing, to make that happen?
You have a choice. You can speak up for yourself, set boundaries, prioritize your well-being, and help create a work culture that's both productive and fulfilling.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. And it's clear that this conversation about work-life balance in India, it's just getting started. And who knows, maybe someday soon, those 90-hour work weeks will be a thing of the past. We'll have a work culture that values both human well-being and economic progress. So until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep striving for that balance.